Matthew Morse, Wood Studio, and in this project we're going to build an awesome Nakashima inspired trestle dining table. Now, wouldn't you want to eat dinner, breakfast, lunch, have the holidays with your family on a big table just like this? I know I do, and I sure love it. So I hope that you guys build this table as well. Now, this real quick commercial part of this whole thing, this is a project on my website that you can go and buy, download the entire project plans, get step-by-step instructions. In this video, we're going to kind of do an overview of the project, so check it out. I hope that you like it. Let's get to it. Where else do we start but pulling out some lumber? Here, on the edges, it's more towards a rift sawn direction, so I have straight grain on all four sides. I flattened one face on all four parts, and then I jointed an edge on all four parts as well. And then I planed these guys to thickness. I moved on over to my table saw and grabbed my final dimension. And now I'm going to cross cut the feet to length. Upper supports for the tabletop, I cross cut those to length. However, there is no set length yet, so I just try to get the maximum yield. It's time to start cutting some joinery. To start, I cut a series of strips at the table saw, and then I take those strips and cross cut them to various lengths to make the parts for my two different router bases. Alright, to do this, the first thing we want to do is define the center as well as mark the direction of our parts. So align these 2 points. Take a marking knife and score the inside corners right here. And then come in with a square, find where those score marks are, continue them all the way across, and then from the other side, bring them around. And we can come in here and line this guy up to the knife marks we made. Now what we can do is come in with our router, come in with a chisel, bring down any high points, reference our edge. Now I can take the other jig and get this to line up. Now I can come in here and remove this material up on top. I'm ready to cut my columns to length. Now it's time to start cutting the other half of the bridle joints. I take measurements for the thickness, then it's time to find the center on my posts, mark where the top of my joint is going to be. So what I've done is I've got my fence and it is aligned so that this guy right here, the blade is centered right on that line I drew for the center of this piece. Above that line, I want just a little bit of room for glue to go up into. Then I can take the piece, turn around 180 degrees, make another cut, and slowly move until I match exactly the distance I wrote down. To get these ridges nice and flat, I'm going to come in with a shoulder plane and take some very light passes. So we're looking at the top of one of my legs, and what we're going to do is come in and make a mark for the top of my mortise and extend my square and make a mark for the lower part of my mortise, and then bring that around to the other side. Draw a line down the center. So now what I want to do is to draw the outer edges of the mortise. So I'm over here at the drill press. What I'm going to do is just drill a little bit more than halfway down the depth from both sides. Take a chisel and I want to just clean up and connect these ridges here. And then I attach the plywood jig with an opening that matches my mortise size, and then secured a fence to the jig. And I've got a 1/4 inch shank bit in it. It's got a bearing on the bottom. Slowly work all the way around, removing the rest of the waste. We've got some nice crisp corners here we can reference. And now you can continue routing away more waste. Come back in with my chisels. And now the bottom bearing bit, I have the post flipped around, and I'll clean up this side of the mortise. Bring up a square, make a line. Now I can start to work to my lines. We're going to work on our trestle. We're going to mill it up. Now instead of going to the table saw and ripping this to its final width, instead I did that at the planer. So now what I want to do is focus on laying out the final length of the board on each side so I can cut it to length. Now what I want to do is lay out the tenon. It's time to cut the shoulders for the tenons on the trestle. Now, in order to do this trick, you have to make sure that your fence is square to the table. And of course, the blade needs to be square to the table as well. Now that the shoulders are defined, it's time to rough out the tenons. Went over to one of my columns, brought it over here to the table, and took a measurement. Just sneak up on a fit really close. So our tenons roughed out, it's time to fit them to our mortises. To do that, I'm going to turn to my rabbet block plane. Our tenons are now fit to our post, and there's just one thing left to do to lock up all this joinery. And that is to move some material from our tenons so that we can create wedges that go into the tenons to spread them out. So just like any good joinery, it starts with layout lines. Now all the material in between our lines is what we're going to remove to create the gap for our wedge. So what I did was I came on over and I changed the miter gauge angle. Take advantage of the fact that two of these cuts happen at the same angle and the other two cuts happen at the other angle. Shut everything down, flip the trestle around, and set up for the other pass at the same angle. After I made those two cuts, I'm going to take my trestle, set it down, and then change the angle on my fence and get this configured for your next cut. Bring your fence back into square. And then you want to bring over your trestle. So if I'm not touching any edges, I can come right in and take my third cut. I'm going to come on in and draw a line. And now over the bandsaw, I'll cut that material away. And I take the piece I just cut and cut it in half. So I'll clean up the edge where I cut. It's time to shape some parts. The first thing we're going to start on here is the trestle itself. I had some extra 1/8 inch MDF lying around, and then over at the bandsaw I carefully cut out one side of the profile. Once I got my curves cut out, I headed on over to the sanding station. I can go back over to the bandsaw and cut out the space for where the tenon goes. Now that I've transferred the final shape of the trestle to both sides, I've taken my trestle itself and I have it between my two farthest dog holes here, holding it securely. I have my jack plane here, just freshly sharpened. Alright, so let's lay out the shapes for the feet here. And where those two marks meet is where we're going to take our bevel gauge and draw a line to. Now what I want to do is draw a line from that point to the very top here. And let's find center. And now what I want to do is draw lines in from the outside. Draw a line connecting these 2 points. And I've set the angle for my miter gauge. I'm now going to sneak up to that very tip of the corner of the foot, or at the bandsaw. I'll remove the rest of the material that we laid out. And now we can clean these up here with a plane and get this nice and smooth. One last thing we can shape here before we move on to the tabletop, and that's the wedges. And then we can knock in that nice, freshly shaped wedge. And now with my slab flattening jig, I take my router and I make passes, removing material from my first board. After I make each pass, I move it a little bit farther up and then make the next pass where the new material starts. And I got the second slab in here now. It's got a bit of a twist, so I've used a wedge to prop up this corner over here. And then I repeat the same thing on the second board using my flattening jig. Alright, second board flat. Now I flip my boards over, and then using the flattening jig, I bring both boards into coplanar and to the same thickness. What I'm going to do is bring the straight edge over and try to find exactly where I want to remove material. I brought my straight edge over and clamped everything down. Plug in the circular saw and make this cut, and then turn around and do the same thing on the other side. So the next step here is to start prepping the edges of these slabs. One of the first things I want to do is get rid of the bark. Here you see me using a 4.5 inch angle grinder with a sanding wheel on it, and I'm just slowly removing material, making sure to keep the contour of the live edge just like it was originally. I'm going to be using a 6-inch random orbital sander here, hooked up to a little shop vac for dust collection. The 6-inch is going to be great because it's going to allow me to cover a lot more square inches or square feet a lot faster. It's time to start working on getting the table supports and the trestle attached to the table. There's some material for my lumber rack, and I ripped those at the bandsaw. What I've done here is I've taken a piece of 1/8 inch oak and cut it in half, and I have 2 parts on each side. And my goal is to get this guy nice and centered. And now I'm going to take some quick clamps and just clamp up the trestle assembly to the table itself. I've roughly placed where the 5 support pieces are going to go for the tabletop. And the 2 guys who connect the supports from the trestle to the supports from the tabletop. Come in here and mark out where that gap begins and ends in some pencil. And then we want to mark out the depth of that gap so that we can remove the material over at the table saw. And as you can see, I have a really nice tight fit with a little bit of a gap for expansion and contraction. And then I made some marks for where I wanted to cut my supports to length, drew in my angle, and cut that at the table saw. Transfer the shape from the support, and then I make some marks for where I want to drill holes to connect the supports to the tabletop. And then the drill press, I first use a Forstner bit to drill countersinks, and then a regular bit to drill my pilot holes. As you can see, I have one of my table supports here clamped down to the tabletop itself. And I've got a long 1/8 inch drill bit here to drill the pilot hole into the top. And I've got my impact driver and my screws. So I'm just going to get to attaching this guy, and I'm going to move down the line until I'm done at the very end. With all the supports now attached, what I'm going to do is take the trestle apart, get the upper supports for the trestle off, and cut those to match the angles that we cut for supports to go right next to it. So I flipped the table over now, and as you can see, I've got my straight edge clamped down. I've got the depth of cut on my circular saw set so that I will be able to cut these as well as miss the clamps that are here with the motor section of the circular saw. Now I'm going to grab a spray bottle and spray some water on the end grain here. I'm taking my low angle jack. You can see where I'm removing material and I'm not. I'm just going to keep working that until I clean this up. We're going to tackle the butterfly keys. So the first thing I did was I took some thin plywood and I ripped it into different size strips. From there I cross-cut my various pieces to different sizes. And then further down the table I've got my 2 longer pieces that not just get longer but taller at the same time to span over the curve that happens at the end of the table. Over at the bandsaw, I cut my piece of East Indian rosewood to length. After that, I then resawed it just a little bit thicker than the final dimensions I want for the depth of my butterfly keys. And then once I mill up my lumber, I cut my different butterfly key sizes to width and length depending on the space they're going to span. And on my miter gauge, I add a piece of 3/4 inch MDF for added support. And during my test cuts, what I did was I just kept raising the blade very slow until I got the 2 corners to just barely miss from meeting. Once I had that, then I proceeded to take my pieces and cut one side of every single piece. When I make this cut again, it's going to leave a little bit of a flat spot in the corner here. So I need to move this over just a touch. And then when I cut the other side off, I'll get nice crisp corners on that side as well. Now, if you need to clean up your butterfly keys a little bit because, well, there's just a little bit of material in between everything, I like to do that with a chisel. So now I'm gonna take a very sharp knife here and knife along the edge. I'm going to just take my pencil and drop it down in those knife lines. With my little compact DeWalt router and a 1/4 inch spiral bit, I set the maximum depth of cut to a 1/16 of an inch less than the thickness of my butterfly key. And my next step is to start coming in here and removing material with my chisels. So you want to do equal amounts. Okay, so now I'm going to take this dust and sprinkle it into my epoxy. And now I'm going to get some epoxy just on these walls and hammer it down. So we need to start cleaning these up. I like to use hand planes, a sander is just fine. But either way, I'm going to clean up all 4 sides and get this nice and surface prepped. So I want to just put a nice little round over on this bottom part here where the screws go through, and then on the end grain here as well, but staying away from the actual top part itself where it meets the bottom of the table. And just sand these rounded edges, and once that's done, you can reattach your table support. So the goal here is to create 2 holes. Forstner bit is going to be drilled into tabletop supports on the trestle itself. This guy here, the stepped one, is going to start on these supports that connect everything together. And now I spend some time doing surface preparation on all the parts in the trestle assembly so I can glue up my legs. And then with a jig, I drill some holes, drive in my dowels so that I can peg my joints. Get this nice and flush. And there you go, 2 beautiful looking pegs. The camera is really wide, so I can show you the entire dining table top. 10 feet long here, it's pretty amazing. We're at the home stretch, just a few more things left to do, and one of those is to sand the top. Now, we sanded the bottom before, so I'm gonna do the same thing here on the top. So as you can see, it's been flipped over, and I'm gonna start work on the bottom part exposed. So what I'm gonna do is get the finish on the bottom and wipe it off and let it sit for a half hour or so, and then wipe it off again before I flip the tabletop over, exposing the top part of it. And just like on the bottom, as soon as you can, wipe it down. While I built up the coats inside the shop on the tabletop, inside the house, I built up my coats of finish on the trestle assembly. And then over at my lathe, I took some oak that I had squared up, turned it round, and then created a taper dowel to hold the top to the base. And after a little bit of finessing, now I can put that in, give it a couple taps. Looks great over here, holds everything down. Well, this is it, everybody. This is the table. I finished putting 3 coats of finish on the taper dowels, let those dry, and brought the table into the house, and she looks great. 10 feet of just walnut awesomeness. Extensions, trestle base, butterfly keys, big joinery, big through mortise and tenon joints, big bridle joints, shaped trestle. What a great project.